Hello there, and welcome back. Today we have our very first installment of video lectures in our next series, specifically focusing on American government and our Unit 2 materials. So, we are looking at the structure of American government. I would suggest making a new header in your notes, just titled Structure of American Government. Continue wherever you last left off. And that's what we're going to be looking at today, is looking at how this crazy government of the United States is organized. Okay, so a little bit of an overview here. Okie dokie. So when we talk about democracy, there are a few different types of democracy. And what's important to know is that we have something called a representative democracy. And this means that the people vote for and elect their leaders. And then those leaders represent their voters' interests. So the people have power, but the people aren't necessarily the ones making the decisions about how the country is run. Instead, they give that power to other people who will represent their interests. That's why it's called a representative democracy. Just another helpful way to remember what the word democracy means and where power lies in a democracy is that democracy is a government that is run by the people. So demo, that root word, means people. And then the second half of the word, krasi, or in Greek, kratia, means power or rule. So it is a government that is run by the people. Even though in America, people might not explicitly make the laws, they at least choose the representatives who are going to make those laws and decide how the government is going to run. So another thing when we talk about how power works in a democracy is that we have powers that are held by the people, and then we have powers that are held by the government. So over on the left-hand side, these go over the powers that are held by the people. So that includes things like voting, protesting, and freedom of speech, being able to voice your opinions about the government, or if you're angry at the government, supporting political campaigns. You can get involved in those political campaigns and knock on door to door, or you could just donate money. You can do things like political activism, working for certain organizations, doing things like teaching, etc. And freedom of the press. This is the news media. Anytime that we watch the news or contribute to the news or write a letter or write anything that we see in a newspaper, that is the power of the people to be able to inform others. And then we have major powers held by the government. These are more of the formal powers that the government has. So they make laws and policies. They determine how the law is applied. So they determine how laws are going to be enforced. Things like the courts decide if someone is breaking the law, if someone isn't breaking the law, etc. They collect taxes, they control how our tax money is used, and they also choose non-elected government officials. So there are plenty of people in government who we don't choose to be there. So the people that we do elect end up choosing those non-elected government officials. And then the last thing they do is that they control the military. So I know that that's a lot of information just on one slide, and that's kind of going to be the case for a lot of these. But the idea is we're kind of doing a big overview here, and we're going to apply these things later. Okay, so our next slide is going to go over another part of our democratic structure, specifically two ideas called checks and balances and separation of powers. So those are two important terms that you got to make sure you have in your notes. So in American government, we have something called checks and balances. This means that no branch of government can do something without it being approved by another branch. That if a branch does something, then another branch has to give them the up or the down. They have to say if that thing was okay or if it was not okay. So for example, this in this diagram over here, this is the executive branch, the president. This is the legislative branch, the Congress. This is the judicial branch, the court. So for example, if Congress writes a law, then the president can veto that law or veto that legislation. They can say, nope, we don't want that law, or that law is not good. Or maybe Congress makes a law, and then the judicial branch can declare that law unconstitutional. They can say, this law doesn't follow the Constitution. So that is a check on their power. It's balancing their power. And then we also have something called separation of powers. This means that every branch has its own powers, and it's designed to avoid one branch from having too much power over the others. So we give the legislative branch certain powers. We give the executive branch certain powers. We give the judicial branch certain powers. The legislative branch isn't able to do what the judicial... That was poor wording. The legislative branch isn't able to do what the judicial branch does, and vice versa. The executive branch isn't allowed to do what the legislative branch does. We separate their powers and separate what they're able to do. So we go back to this point, avoiding one branch from having too much power. Okay, so this is where we're going to start to get in the weeds a little bit about the different branches of government. And this is where that Constitution test in the 8th grade is really going to come in handy here. Your ability to just know these different branches and know what they do. I know that knowing this structure can get really annoying and like really tedious, but just having it up here and having this basic information is really helpful in terms of navigating a lot of these other big issues that we're going to be talking about. So we've got our 3 branches of government. We've got the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. So the legislative branch, they write laws. I should underline these. Legislative branch, they write laws. The executive branch, they enforce the law. And then the judicial branch, they interpret the law. So what does all that mean? Let's chat about it. So in the legislative branch, the structure is that it's broken up into 2 parts, that we have 2 parts of the legislative branch. Number 1, we have the House of Representatives, and number 2, we have the Senate. They're right here. The House of Representatives has 435 elected officials. We choose them, and that varies by state. So if you have more people in your state, then you're going to have more representatives. For example, California has the most people in their state, so they have the most representatives. It is different in the Senate, and that is the other part of the Congress. So in the Senate, there are 100 members total, and there are 2 for each state. Hold on, I'm going to write one more thing. Congress is broken into 2 different parts. That's an important distinction there. So Congress is broken up into 2 parts. We have the House and we have the Senate. Together, they make Congress. Okay, last thing, in Congress, those folks are elected by the people. And what is the purpose of Congress? Well, they have 2 main jobs. They have a lot more jobs than this, but they're 2 main jobs. Number 1, they make laws and policies that represent what the people want. And number 2, they make the country's budget. They have control over how our tax money is used. Our next section is the executive branch, and they're the folks who enforce the law. And this is broken into, I don't know, I must have copied that. That's broken into 3 parts. God, I made some mistakes here. Okay, so broken into 3 parts. First, we have the president. Obviously, he or she leads the federal government, or they. Then we have the vice president. They are the second in command to the president. Essentially, if the president dies, the vice president is the person who takes over. And then we also have the cabinet. And this is a group of leaders and experts who help the president run the country. So these are people that are chosen by the president, by the president and the vice president. And then they just help the president run the country. The president is only one person, and the federal government is made up of hundreds of thousands of employees. So the cabinet is going to help them with that process. Now, how are they chosen? So the president and the vice president are chosen by the people. Obviously, you remember we had an election at the start of November. And then our cabinet members, those people are chosen by the president and the vice president, but then they're approved by the Senate over here, going back to our idea about checks and balances. So what is the purpose of the executive branch? Well, they've got 2 main jobs. Number 1, they've got to make sure that people follow the law or that policies and rules are enforced that the legislative branch makes. And then number 2, they've got to make sure that the government runs smoothly. The president is essentially like the head of the federal government. They're there to make sure that everything runs smoothly, that the trains run on time and everything is working out. I'm going to move this little picture. Okay, and then lastly, we have our judicial branch. These are the folks who interpret the law. And the main part of the judicial branch that we're going to focus on is the Supreme Court. There are some other courts in the country. We're just going to be focusing on the Supreme Court today. And the members of the Supreme Court, those folks are chosen by the president, but they have to be approved by our friends over in the Senate. And what does the judicial branch do? Well, they've got 3 key purposes. Number one, they determine if people broke the law. So, like standard, if you break the law, what's your punishment? Do you get a punishment, etc. Number two, they determine if people's rights have been violated. So if someone says, hey, this person was racist to me and they're taking away my rights and I was fired on the basis of race. If you are saying that your rights were taken away, that your constitutional rights are being violated, then you go to the court and you say, hey, my rights are being taken away and that needs to be fixed. And then the last thing that the judicial branch does is they determine if laws follow the Constitution. Sometimes Congress is going to write laws that might not follow the Constitution. The judicial branch is going to step in and try to fix that or try to let folks know if that's the case. So let's look at an example of how all of this works. So step one, we're going to start in our legislative branch. Legislative branch is going to write a law that says businesses cannot use certain products because they cause pollution. This is just hypothetical. So they write that law, they pass it, the president signs it. Great. Step two, the executive branch. The president is going to approve the law. The president has the choice to either approve the law or deny the law, something called a veto. In this example, the president is approving the law. And then they tell their administration to ensure companies follow the rule. He goes and tells his folks over at the cabinet, he says, hey, we've got this new law. You've got to make sure that people follow it and that that companies are following this. And if they don't, then we need to make sure that they do. And then step three would be, let's say that law goes to the judicial branch. Maybe a business owner says that his rights are being taken away, that the government made this law and it violates his rights. So he is going to sue the government. Let's say the court hears his case and they say that the law does not follow the Constitution. They say, this law takes away this person's freedom of who knows what, violates some right in the Constitution. So then Congress, it goes back to Congress. We can see this arrow is going to go back to Congress and they have to rewrite that law in a way that's going to follow the Constitution. Okay, folks, and that's the basics about our structure. We're going to get more into the party system at a later date. That's another really important part of all of this, but that'll be tomorrow. Okay, folks. Alrighty, see you later. Looking forward to that Kahoot. Bye, y'all.